No one really knows for sure Elevate Elo Divrei Elohim Chaim, but this is the result we live by. 21 of ER 5786, Friday, May 8th. Rukadada Elohim Malakal Al Mashirka Shem Mitzvah Tabani Al Sefirat Omer. Blessed are you, Hashem, God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us with his commandments and commanded us concerning the counting of the Omer. Today is 37 days, which is 5 weeks and 2 days of the Omer. May the merciful one restore unto us the services of the Beit HaMikdash speedily in our days. Amen. Salah. This service. All right. May the merciful one restore unto us the service of the Beit HaMikdash speedily in our days. Amen. Salah.
The question that I have is this one went under the radar.
3761, creation of the world, birth of Adam and Eve. Chava. 3631, 130, Seth, son of Adam, was born. 3526, 235, Enosh, son of Seth, was born. 3436, 325, Kenan, son of Enosh, was born. 3366, 395, Mahalel, son of Kenan, was born. 3301, 460, Yared, son of Mahalel, was born. Kuafi, Kabbalah, and Kuafi. We've been doing this bitch for the pelts of an animal, usually taken with a knife. 133 days.
Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. One of the most difficult aspects in starting to study Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah is getting a handle on just how those ideas develop over time. It's tempting to think that, for instance, Kabbalah has just always existed in the form that we have it, or that Kabbalah is just one thing at all. Of course, neither of these positions is really tenable. Such notions developed greatly through the ages and are still developing. And there are now, and there have always been, numerous mutually exclusive schools of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. This class is meant to serve as an introduction to Jewish mysticism and a point of view of its incredibly complex development from the prophets of ancient Israel to the writers of modern Testament. Of course, this series isn't meant to be exhaustive by any means, but only should serve as a springboard for deeper study and reflection, and hopefully it will also enable you to situate developments of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah in their historical and cultural context, and hopefully embolden you to dive into the primary texts, which are admittedly as sublime as they are obscure. Let me express my gratitude to Congregation Tefillah for allowing me to use these lectures to reach a larger audience here on Esoterica. If you want, you can find the entire series under the playlist Entering the Garden, Introduction to Jewish Mysticism and Kabbalah. I'll be uploading them over the next few weeks. You can find these episodes on if you want to watch them. You can find that playlist. If you find this series on Kabbalah interesting, I'd hope you check out my other content on topics in esotericism, and perhaps consider supporting the production of free academic and scholarly topics in hermetic philosophy by joining my Patreon or one donation. You can find those links below, and I really appreciate your consideration. Now, let's enter the garden of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Folks, so let's just review a bit about Shabtai Tzvi, and let's move past Shabtai. We spent enough time on this guy. As you can see, he's there on the left. And that, as I mentioned a minute ago, this is a picture from this is what he probably looked like. It's actually pretty difficult to underplay the disaster that was Shabbatianism. We're talking about a movement that basically began in 1666 and didn't end until 1880s. We're talking about a movement, a sort of mobile disaster inside of Judaism that led people to believe that abandoning Judaism was part of their salvation. I can't really articulate when people believe that converting to a religion that hates them, that actively is actively seeking their conversion to destroy their identity, that's a disaster. It's really a disaster. Now, when an individual Jew decides to convert, when an individual Jew decides to leave Judaism for reasons of conscience, that's their business and that's their right. Every Jew should be allowed to convert to whatever religion they find they see fit. But the truth of the matter is, these people weren't converting because of a choice they were making on their own. They were converted because they were being led by people who delusionally believed in their messianic prowess and their messianic message. So, in that way, I do see this as a kind of moving disaster, a train wreck stretched over 2 centuries, basically. And Frankism was especially bad. We're talking about a situation where Jews have been systematically repressed for centuries in Poland and into Catholicism. And as you can imagine, the moment they converted into Catholicism and ditto when they converted into Islam, converting back was not an easy thing. We should not forget that converting back out of Islam is the death penalty. That's a death penalty case. And of course, no one has to remind anyone about the horrors of the Spanish Inquisition. Converting to Catholicism and then trying to convert back, it's not going to happen. This is a one-way street, and Frankism and Shabbatianism were a disaster in many ways for thousands of Jews over the course of a couple centuries. And I think these should be considered forced conversions of a certain time because they were predicated on the idea of some apocalyptic pretension. Things were ultimately going to come to an end really fast. And that never materialized. The end just got delayed and delayed and delayed. And secondly, the reasons why these conversions from Judaism to Catholicism or Islam, it was never systematic. There was never any spelled out theory about why this is supposed to happen and how it's supposed to work. You have a bunch of charismatic men at the center of this movement who benefited greatly from these conversions. Frank benefited greatly. Shabbatai, in his own way, also benefited. And this is a situation where these people were led into conversions that were, I think, forced by the charismatic leaders of that movement. In the same way that I don't think they'd be letting Jonestown kill themselves. I refuse to characterize what happened in Jonestown as mass suicide. That was mass murder, precipitated by Jim Jones. And so I think that in many ways these conversions were forced. They were forced by the charisma at some level of these leaders. And to be clear, an argument can be made, and I would make the argument, that this is what happens when mysticism goes off the rails. This is what happens when rationalism is abandoned. This is what happens when you allow emotion and you allow fervor and mystical beliefs that you don't really understand to basically run ramshot. And at the end of the day, I'm very sympathetic to mysticism. I'm very sympathetic in many ways to Kabbalah. But this is the gutter of Kabbalah. It is mass conversions, and it is the disaster of the Shabbatian movement. Now, what's interesting about that is that given this disaster, given the extraordinary disappointment of the Shabbatian movement, after all this, many people who had seen the dangers of what Kabbalah could do, what Kabbalah could do unchecked, just abandoned it. They said this whole Kabbalistic thing, this entire thing, led us gutter of mass conversion. That's to be sure, we'll talk about that more tonight. They did realize it was dangerous, and they made safeguards. They put rails on the system to ensure that it did not go off the rails like this again. And yet, Kabbalah survived. It really got off with a pretty light touch, actually. And I think that part of the reason why is because the Shabbatian movement, you can imagine, I always imagine the movement as coming in like a wave. There's this huge Shabbatian wave that comes in like the tide, and then when the tide comes out, all this will be behind, but the water's gone. Again, will help to grow the new. And what's left behind is the black earth that will ultimately grow new things. So in many ways, scholarship of a previous generation argued that Kabbalah made Shabbat possible. I don't think that's true. I think that actually made Kabbalah possible. I think that's why Kabbalah survived. Because the Kabbalah is so much more sophisticated, it's so much more deep, it's so much more rich than Shabbatai Tzvi and the Frankists. Who only ever really, aside from Nathan of Gaza, who only really ever developed the most thin, superficial, self-serving, apocalyptic version of Kabbalah that was engineered basically to deify them. And at the end of the day, the Kabbalah that they rode in on was a pretty crap Kabbalah. With the exception of Nathan of Gaza, who I think was very profound with the Kabbalah. I will give that to Nathan of Gaza. But Shabbatai himself, Frank, they were never deep Kabbalists, and they were never really actually, I think, about the Kabbalist life. I think at the end of the day, they were about themselves, and their actions proved it. And when they left, the Kabbalah could stand on its own. It didn't need them. It existed before them. It was deeper and richer than they could have possibly imagined. And anyways, it survived them and thrived. So tonight we talk about the Kabbalah in the aftermath of Shabbatai. And what I wanted to really drive home about this is I don't want to talk about this as post-Shabbatian Kabbalah. Because Shabbatai Tzvi and the Frankist movement and all that stuff that we've been talking about, that's an aberration. And it's like a night where everyone had a bender. You know, everyone wanted benders. They went to New Orleans, they got trashed, they did all the things, and they went back to their homes. And they shook off the bend. And so you can think about the Shabbatian movement as kind of a big bender. Went down there, got trash, big coat, and they did all. Then when they came back home, they straightened up, and it was over. And so I think of the Shabbatian movement as a kind of bender in the history of the Jews. So what happens in the immediate aftermath of 1966 when Shabbatai converts? Well, obviously the first thing that people who are diehard believers they can to convince themselves using every tool they have in Kabbalah and Torah to convince themselves Shabbatai Tzvi is the Messiah, no matter what. No matter if he apostatizes, no matter if he dies, no matter who splits into three groups, no matter if they all have different Catholicism, there's always someone out there willing to do the work and try to convince everyone that this is true. And there are diehards in every religion, there are diehards in almost every belief system, and no matter what happens, they will convince themselves of what they want to believe. So that's one camp. We spend a lot of time talking about them. They're out there. They're going to be out there into the 1880s, probably. Also, in the immediate aftermath of 1666, there were a ton of people who realized that this was a catastrophe. There were people who believed in Shabbatai. In 1666, when he apostatized, they realized, oh man, this was really bad. And what's also critically important about this is that the people who, at the very beginning of this, who realized this was a disaster, people like Menachem in Israel, those people who knew from the very beginning this was going to be a crazy thing, never did the Tokusa moment, so far as I know. From what I know in the history of Judaism, there's never a major I told you so moment where people gloat and people say, I told you so, and you can go jump in a river, you believed in this guy, and now you're barking back in the tree, you're barking back in my tree trying to get back in synagogue. You were happy this idiot. Now he's abandoned. You can go Jews, I've seen people make this mistake. Welcome them back. And to my knowledge, I don't see the told you so moment. They just didn't do that. They were very magnanimous, and they began to do the work. And what was the work? The work was, let's just pretend this never happened. Right? Let's just pretend this never happened. So what did they do? The second camp, people that realized it was a disaster, they went back to doing what they were doing before Shabbatai. They went back to the intellectual labor of trying to make Kabbalah work. That is to say, systematizing it. Trying to figure out how that Lurianic Kabbalah lines up with Word of Erech. Going back to the heavy lifting, trying to do Kabbalah in a pretty systematic.
They don't know that's the huh? They did. No, they thought. I think they thought that it actually has like all these books and stuff he's gonna pull out and he's gonna. No. Testifying to the U.S. Commission. Right. So what's the Senate?
In a careful way. Now, that's not to say they just ignored it completely. They realized that inside something inside of the temple was dangerous. Because it had gone off the rails. It had gone off the rails, crazy off the rails. And so they began slowly to think about how to implement safeguards to prevent this from happening. This could have probably. Can you imagine what would have happened if all those Jews would have got on those boats and began to sail into the Mediterranean to reach Palestine? It could have been terrifying. Tens of thousands of Jews would have died. They could have been denied entry into the Ottoman Empire. And who knows what would have happened? They would sail back to Spain. They're going to arrive as refugees in Christian Europe. This could have been a much worse than it was. It's actually very lucky that it's only as bad as it was. The abyss, basically, allowed to prevent it from going off the rails again. And what do those bumpers look like? The main thing is, public Kabbalistic teachings, especially advanced Kabbalah, just stop. They just stop. You just cannot teach people quantum mechanics if they don't understand Newtonians. You just can't. You cannot teach people how to weld if they've never held a hammer before. You have to. You cannot deliver these incredibly complex people basically just don't even have a Torah knowledge. Especially people who've been living in lands who'd only recently converted back to Judaism. They see the teaching Kabbalah. Many of us grit. That makes many of us think, oh, these elitists, how dare they hide this? Well, you gotta put yourself in their shoes. These people were playing, it's like toddlers playing with fire. These people were not prepared to deal with this, and they were able to be convinced of something basically insane. Because they heard all these crazy Kabbalistic ideas, they were able to basically convince themselves. So, what ends up happening is that the first thing is that Kabbalah begins to withdraw, especially technical stuff. Then a creeping kind of legalism begins to creep in. And that legalism takes the form of safeguards. You need to vet who can learn them. And how do you vet? You vet them based on other factors of stability. What are those things look like? But they're old enough. You don't teach a 13-year-old Kabbalah. You shouldn't, according to this idea. You have to wait. Maybe 40. And that was the number they settled on. I bet folks have heard that. Teach Kabbalah to a bachelor? No, because a bachelor might get so crazily Kabbalistic, they're just married to God, and they don't want to actually get married to a woman or whatever, right? True from a traditional perspective. So they need to be married. They need to have a job. They need to have kids. They need something anchoring them to this world. I've actually heard somewhere that Air Force pilots in another plane flying around. The idea is they need to be anchored in this world. You can go to the other world. You can go to the Kabbalistic and so you can go up the Sephirot, fine. But you need something anchoring you in this world. You need a job, you need kids and a wife, you need family. You cannot just be Kabbalah. That's unhealthy. So they begin to try to implement things at the community level that are real, people who aren't drunks, people who are other kinds, they have other kinds of things that are anchored in the world. Now, again, does that sound elitist to you? Maybe it does sound elitist to you. But is it reasonable? I think it's reasonable. Is it reasonable in just what happened with Shabbat? I think it's very eminently reasonable. So again, I think it's not a bizarre idea. Third, there is a shift away in Kabbalah, away from cosmological speculation. That cosmological stuff has led to bizarre ideas about how the world got created, how Messiah became implanted in the world, like we talked about last time with the Jewish dragons. And messing just ground to a halt. That's over. It's not going to do messianic speculation. By the way, that's a return to Talmud. The Talmud is very clear. The Talmud says do not speculate about the beginning, do not speculate about the end. Speculate about now. Right? Speculate about now. Don't deal with sheep. Do not deal with the end of the world. Deal with now. That's a return to very orthodox Judaism. We're going to see that when we get to Chassidism is the epitome of mystification, the mysticism of the now. Chassidism says the now. The now. What is happening right in front of your face, then what happened back then and what's going to happen later. And so Hasidism is going to pioneer the mysticism of now. So they really take this into there's a shift away from what's going on here. Right? Because trying to figure out what's going on here, that was dangerous. So what's the shift? The shift is into here. The shift is into here. Right? The shift is into the mind and the heart. It's about personal piety. And so it's all about fixing you. We are not focusing our attention on trying to become a Messiah anymore. That was a disaster. We're done with that. What do we do now? We now focus our attention on our inner piety. And so the shift in the Kabbalistic language is now toward inner tikkun. Not messianic saving the world stuff. It's about saving you and your community. And that's when intense piety comes in of these things we'll talk about in a minute. This idea of kavanot, intense spiritual concentration, and following Jewish law very scrupulously. Remember, part of what people were Shabbat movement was the rejection of Jewish law. And so what ends up happening is that Jewish law becomes front and center, just like it was early on. Remember, the Zohar is highly legal. The Zohar never said you could abandon the law. In fact, the Zohar is very clear that the law, that Kabbalah without the Jewish law, without Kabbalah, without Halakha, is incoherent. And so, in many ways, the post-Shabbat movement is a return to Kabbalah and truth. It is exactly divorcing Kabbalah from Halakha. That was a disaster in the mind of his Kabbalists. I tend to agree. And so this movement is a return back to the old school days of Kabbalah. So in the end of the day, Kabbalah will endure. Thank God. It deserves to endure. It should. Thank God it wasn't thrown out with the baby with the bathwater. Right? I'm glad, very glad. But we have to admit that I think the kind of safeguards that get put on Kabbalah in the aftermath of all this are not unreasonable. What's also important about this is the story sometimes gets told from a supercentric perspective. Surprise, the Eurocentrism narrative. The truth of the matter also is that Kabbalistic centers are also appearing all over the Jewish world. In many places in which Shabbatism really never took a big hold. And those places are going to be places like Morocco, places like Yemen, although Shabbatism was very popular in Yemen and Morocco, Kurdistan, Aleppo, and Baghdad. Also in Jerusalem. Jerusalem, you'll remember, was a holdout. Jerusalem condemned Shabbatism from the very beginning. So these centers in the Arab world, not in the European world, are going to be the first to come back online, and they're going to begin producing an enormous amount of Kabbalistic literature. Now, the sad truth of that is that a lot of that literature has been lost, especially as Jews fled Arab lands or expelled from Arab lands. A lot of that literature has been lost. And when I say manuscript, I mean handwritten books from the 16th century, 17th century. So there's not even printed editions of these books. But we know, and I know this because of other scholars who sort of serve literature, there is a Kabbalistic literature out there heavily working on systematizing Lurianic Kabbalah at this time. One of the real interesting personalities that appears in all this is Athna Barzani. Athna Barzani is probably the first woman rabbi that we know of. like someone who actually may have really held that title. And she was a Kabbalist, and she seems to have had supernatural powers. She lived in Kurdistan in what is now northern Iraq. And her father was very charismatic. He died, and there was no one basically to take his place because he was just such a macher. And the only person that qualified was his daughter. And so by default, his daughter took his place, and Barzani becomes basically, I think, the world's first real, and she's an active Kabbalist. And there's a great children's book about her too, by the way. I don't know if folks have seen the children's book, just came out recently. So there's a children's book about her. I can look it up if folks want to look at it. But it's really neat. She's just a really incredible character. She's just a really incredible, and I think it's worth mentioning that we have one of the few women Kabbalists at this time that we can name. So I just want to make sure to name that Barzani. There are two major centers that emerge in this period in the world of Kabbalah. One in Jerusalem and one in what is now Poland. That's already telling you sort of the world's dividing again. Poland's going to be a center of Jewish life, of course, and Jerusalem will be as well. The first one is Beit El, the House of God, founded by Yemenite Kabbalists. Right? We haven't talked much about Yemenite Kabbalists. There were tons of Yemenite Kabbalists. And Beit El was founded by probably one of the most erudite Kabbalists of his day. I would say he's probably the most erudite Kabbalist of his day, Shalom Mizrahi Sharabi. And Sharabi's physical school, the actual school that he taught in, survived all the way to the 1920s. It was only destroyed in an earthquake in Jerusalem. You could have gone there in the 1920s. The physical school was still there. And Kabbalists in his school were still alive as late as 1920. He had longest Kabbalistic universities, basically, in the world. And so, again, so much of the way we're taught Kabbalah is so Eurocentric. But the truth of the matter is, this is a Mizrahi Jew, Yemenite Jew, running one of the longest functioning Kabbalistic schools in Jerusalem. So he died in 1777, and his Kabbalah becomes very important. Now, the main thing that they do in the school of Beit El is that it's social and it's theoretical. The first thing they do is they turn their attention exclusively to Lorraine Kabbalah. They are probably the principal systematizers of Lorraine Kabbalah in this area. The main systematizers of these ideas. They systematize it around the use of kavanot. And these kavanot, I know we use the word kavanot kind of things to meditate on, but another way of thinking of kavanot, at least in this Kabbalistic sense, is to think of them as foci of spiritual concentration. Imagine one's soul light, the infinite, best of the infinite light of the Godhead. You have to focus. It's just like radio wave or any other kind of thing. If you have unfocused energy, it doesn't do anything. It's only by focusing that energy, that focusing that spiritual energy, that you kind of get on the wavelength of God. It sounds super New Agey, but there's a reason why they use New Agey people use the metaphors they do. They're not bad metaphors. And the idea is that you have this wild energy, this wild spiritual energy, and you have to focus it, and you focus it in prayer. Prayer is the lens that focuses this energy, and that the way that you focus it, the lens of prayer is focused using these kavanot. And Sharabi's Siddur, which has been published, you can get his Siddur. It's calling Hebrew, and he's hundreds of these. And these kavanot are sort of like micro adjustments of your soul to focus your soul during prayer on various aspects of correcting and shaping your inner various aspects of the sphirot, how you want to comport your soul as it reaches up into the spiritual supernal world. And so it's through these kavanot, these very complicated kavanot, which were actually written down. You have to memorize them. They're exams, kavanot exams. You have to know how to match the exams up, apparently. This was a very rigorous school of Kabbalah. But notice here again, it's about the interior life of the Kabbalist. It's not about some other stuff. It's about learning to focus your spiritual being upon God in a radically sharp, defined, and focused way. What's interesting about the school is that two things are interesting about it. It was incredibly student, teacher oriented, which is to say they did not teach this stuff publicly. You could not go listen to a lecture publicly. You had to be tested, you had to be declared, you had to have incredible levels of education to even knock on the door. So this was a school that heavily prioritized a high level of rigorous Jewish life. So this is not just sort of people within Latino. I mean, you had to rigorously apply yourself to Judaism. You had to take exams. This is Kabbalah at its most spiritually athletic. Further, you could decide basically in India never teach this stuff publicly. And secondly, you had to sign a letter of agreement that you pledged yourself to the school of Bethel, and that you would pledge yourself for your entire life in the world to come. You pledge yourself, even in the world to come, that you would only study with other members of Bethel in the world to come too. In the base midrashes, in Olam Haba, in the house of study in the world to come. Bethel would be there, you had to go study there. And so even the idea here is that you had to dedicate yourself to eternity to the school. And so, again, a high level of rigor. People still matriculating all the way through the early 20th century. And like I said, the last inheritor of the school of the Kavanot of Shalom Mizrahi, Rabbi, blessed memory, he died in 1969. So it's this one century. The other major school appeared in Poland, right? And Brody, what is now Poland, and this was known as the Klois. Right, so the Klois was like a spiritual fraternity. It wasn't an actual school in the sense of Bethel, where you went to a place and learned. It was much more like a spiritual fraternity where we had various kinds of people, sort of a general organization of spirituality. I don't want to exactly compare it to Freemasons, but it was something like a spiritual Kabbalistic fraternity. And it also focused heavily on Lurianic Kabbalah. They're all hunkering down on Lurianic Kabbalistic standard of Kabbalah. But the thing you'll notice about this is it's primarily attracting Lithuanians. So those Lithuanian men are a bit more elitist, and they're much more intellectualist, right? So there's a high level of intellectualist elitism going on in the Lurianic world, or in the Lithuanian world. And with some exceptions, there are definitely fools there too. But generally speaking, this is a more heavily intellectualist form of Kabbalah. So the Jerusalemite school is much more prayer-oriented. The Polish school, the Klois, is much more intellectually-oriented. They're much more interested in systematizing Kabbalah and really hammering out exactly a kind of systematic theology of Judaism that is basically Lurianic Kabbalah. Now, they do publish a lot of their works. We actually have a ton of works published by members of the Klois. So they did publish books. These books are very technical. I tried to look at some of them today in early Hebrew books, and I couldn't hardly heads or tails of the stuff. You have to. The level of Kabbalistic education, the level of Talmudic education, the level of these guys. These are people who are pilots. I was trying to read some of this stuff today. Can't make it. I mean, it's just so high level. Their books do survive in early modern books. You can actually read them online if you want to. Check them out. Like I said, I really struggle to make even 10, 15 sentences make sense to me. Kind of barely can follow it. Some kind of crazy post-structuralist people just reading that. Although it's that challenging. Their works are also published, but there are no translations. There are no modern editions. I don't know if they've even been reprinted since then. And you're beginning to hear a common thing now, right? They only exist at this time. They've never been reprinted. They've never been translated. The reason for that, actually, very clearly, I'll go ahead and spoiler Holocaust. The Holocaust is the complete cultural interruption of Kabbalah. It amputates an entire people, not just from their families, but it amputates people from their entire world. And basically, this stuff just gets banned. I mean, that's what happens when you flee for your life. You just can't save this stuff. So much of this literature is amorphic, and it's going to take 3 generations of scholars to basically bring back into Judaism. It's going to take that, at least that many. It is a monumental task. And this time period, by the way, I think disputed Kabbalist literature ever written. And it languishes in complete obscurity because there are just so few people with the skills to bring them into modernity. The Hebrew skills, the Kabbalah skills, the Bible skills. It just doesn't exist. It just the level of Kabbalah scholarship of this time, 1750s, 1800s, even into the 19th century, the level of Kabbalah scholarship is so high in Central Europe that it never ever recovered. And it's going to take 100 years, 200 years probably, to recover, to get Kabbalah scholarship back up to where it was. This school is typically a bit more rationalistic. And when I say rationalistic, what I mean is they're intellectualists. For them, they're trying to systematize Kabbalah into a system of basically theology. They're trying to formulate a Jewish theology that makes sense. And for folks who know a little bit about the Litvish world, you can probably tell I have a great deal of sympathy for the Litvish world. I'm much more heavily identified with the yeshivish Litvish world and the Hasidic world as well. But as you may know, folks who study the Talmud, the famous Brisker method emerges out of the Litvish world. The Brisker method is known to be, they compare it to balancing equations. It's like doing, it's like you were balanced chemical stuff in chemistry. It's like taking things apart at a killer level. And so Brisker is infamous for its pill pool, its nitpicking, making tiny experiments, analyzing things in their tiny detail, as opposed to how do we apply all this? They don't care. They're like, no, we must very strictly understand every single logical relationship. And so this is the world that produced some of the greatest logic textbooks and Jewish logic, some of the greatest logic textbooks in Halacha. The Litvish world is famous and infamous for this. What this gives rise to is heavily influenced culture and a heavily elitist culture. And as you might imagine, and again, when I say elitist, I mean that in both the good sense and the bad sense of that word. I mean that in the good sense that these are elite scholars. In just a bad way. These are some of the smartest Jews in the world working on Judaism. They are this is the Nobel Prize winners of Judaism working in Kabbalah and stuff. Now that also gives them a sense that they're superior. They do see that these Amchite Jews, these poor Jews, these Polish Jews, working in the fields in the shtetl, barely can read, scratch together an education to read the Siddur. They do think of themselves as somehow better. Not somehow, they're better. I mean, in the same way that I think a Nobel Prize winner is going to think a high school student in physics. I mean this now in the negative sense. An intellectualist develops in this Litvish world, where they really do believe, among Jews, they can do their very best and maybe they want to end God. But can they really serve God? Can they understand God? Can they really do the heavy lifting of being a Jew? No. Not really. They're never going to buy that. Sort of pumpkin pie. This intellectualist elitist trend is going to take hold in Central Europe, especially among the Litvak. I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for the Litvak school, but that trend does take hold. And it's into that trend. Hasidism will emerge in that way in lots of ways, obviously. The main thing that's interesting about it is that it is neither Shabbatian, although there is a lot of similarity to Shabbatianism. We'll talk about that in a minute. So it seems to have preserved many of the attractive things that make Shabbatianism popular. So it seems to have kind of produced a Shabbatianism without Shabbat. It has so many of the elements of Shabbatianism, but it doesn't have the kind of interior heresy of all the effusion, all of the emotion, all of the passion, all of the messianic implication, but it does not center Shabbat students. It's not Shabbat. Probably. The other thing is this intellectualism doesn't go in the direction of the Litvish world. It's a unique way of sailing between a real difference in the Jewish world, whereas the Litvish world is very intellectual, very elitist, it doesn't go that direction, and it doesn't go in the absolute antinomian direction of fusion and joy and do whatever you want. World changing in the Jewish world. In many ways, Hasidism is for most people at this point, which is Orthodox Judaism. It will be that successful. Hasidism will be that successful. So it's done, of course, by the mystic, and you should read something like Magician. He was basically a Jewish magician. This was a thing that was practiced back this time. It was a club. You would make amulets, and you would do mystical herbal treatments, and you would do all kinds of what we would now recognize as basically Jewish magic. There was a bunch of these guys. They referred to themselves as Baal Shem, and they of course that's the Baal Shem Tov. And he, I should not say 1860s, or 60s. He was a mystical healer. He did a lot of relatively parochial jobs. He was sort of a beadle in synagogue to taught kids. He was never a person outside of the movement until he really came into his own as a kind of extraordinarily innovative and charismatic preacher of a new kind of Judaism. And this new kind of Judaism was heavily mystically involved, although in a very modified way. I'll talk about that more in a minute. And it was a very effusive form of Judaism. It was accessible to anyone. It was not a Judaism that the Judaism of elite scholars. It was a Judaism that could be accessible to anyone walking along the road on a day's journey needing mud. So the ideas of the Baal Shem Tov, they bring to bear all of the enthusiasm of the Shabbat movement, but incredibly important, but a halachic rigor that anchors it in the traditional world of Jewish life. So it does the work. Right? The Baal Shem Tov he squared the circle. He could bring the energy of the Shabbat movement, but he could also anchor it and locate it in the world of rigorous halachic Judaism. And there's a slogan, I think, for the Hasidic movement. It's actually to be found in Tikkun Zohar 123 base. And this is probably the most famous, I think, basic slogan of Hasidism. Right? Yiddish accent. Late atar panui. So this literally means in Aramaic, there is no place devoid of God. Literally, there's no place devoid of Him, God. Everywhere they say, take the gematria of Elohim, right, and the gematria of Teva, nature, they add up to the same thing. Elohim and Teva are the same thing. God is nature. Sounds like Spinoza, a little bit like Spinoza, right? They say, look, there is no place. God cannot be anywhere other than where God is, and there can be no place devoid of God, therefore everywhere is where God is. Now, not everything is God. They're pantheists, not pantheists. And they say that, yes, there are things that are not God. All kinds of things. Everything around you is not God, but hiding underneath no place where God is not. And so the thing that one must do is one must focus on the immanence of God. One must uncover the reality of God all around yourself and in you. And this task is to show that God is in all being, God is in all things, God is in all acts. That even the task of changing the tire is an act of piety. If you see God in it, if you find God in it. And so the idea here is that God is everywhere. And piety The task of piety is to uncover the divinity all around you. But God hides God's self. You never see God's face, you see God's back. So God's back is to see all around us, and to seek God's face in the most tiny things that you do. That is, of course, something at the core of the Hasidic ethos. It's a profoundly beautiful poetic ethos. So, the task is not just to follow Jewish law, but you must, because Jewish law is the primary gateway to God. But it's to realize that everything allows you to approach God. Everything that you are allows you to cling to God. The vague core idea in Hasidism that by clinging to God, by uncovering God in everything you do, the moment you take a sip of wine, the sweetness of the wine is a taste that the light of the Shabbat candle, the light in the Shabbat candle is an entrance into seeing the light of God. And so they cover your eyes before you see them for the first time in Shabbat, so that when you uncover your eyes, you see them. You may see them without the cover, the back of God, peer directly into the light, and there is a shade. Right? That is Hasidism. Just the light of the candles to God. Everywhere is God hiding, and the process is there to find God. And ditto, of course, where can you find God most profound? In you. Because you're made in the image of God. You're made You're made in the image of God. You're a God. But the mirror is dirty. How do you clean the mirror? You undergo a process called tool hydration. You can clean the mirror of all creation. Right? The emptying out of what is. And as you empty out, as you negate what is, what's left behind from the negation of what is, and so you purify your mind. You don't think bad thoughts. And if you do think bad thoughts, you convert the bad thoughts into good thoughts. If you see a beautiful woman walking around the road and you lust after her intensely, feel the lust. Let the lust wash over you. Feel the passion in your body. And know that the beauty and the lust that you feel with a woman walking down the road is just a pale glimpse of how much you crave to love God. Convert the feeling of the lust, of the sin, of the Aveira, convert it into the passion that you would have for God. So it's not about blotting out things. It's not about not feeling things. It's not about going under ascetic practices and rolling around the snow. So don't feel things, feel it. The sin is real. You convert the sin, redeem the sin, give to the Aveira a tikkun, give to the sin a reparation, and you elevate yourself. You'll cleanse your ego. You'll elevate yourself to the eternity. So all of these things allow you to approach God in your everyday life. Everyday life. Everything around you hides God and is God. And you can approach those things. So much of Kabbalah became so intellectual in the Jewish world. It became so about figuring out how the Sphira do this, where things so, how do things so empty itself out, Shimu, and what are the shards left behind, how the shards fall to this part. It's just very complicated intellectual thing. Hasidism said, what really matters to most people is they must encounter the physical world, the world around them, the month around them, the food they eat, the bed they sleep in, the clothes they wear. They must encounter all those things. The movement of their very body. That's where they need to find God. Not as some intellectualist trying to figure out spirit stuff. Now, they don't abandon that. To them, what matters is worship through embodiment. Avoid a gabagash. Right? Worship, avodah bagash. Worshiping that physicality is a gateway to divinity. That the body and sex, the body and eating, the body and feeling your body, even injury, can be. So this is a radical democratization of this work comes out. This all gets focused in on the leaders of the movement. the leaders of the movement become these charismatic, and they were fabulous charismatic people with supernatural powers. You often hear stories of people who can look, they can see things happening from hundreds of miles away, and all kinds of, there's all kinds of things in the Hasidic world that go these stories about these leaders. These leaders establish courts, dynasties. When I say courts and dynasties, these rabbis, these tzaddukim, these rabbis, they live like kings and have the ability to intercess on behalf of God. They're so righteous that their soul brushes up against God. And if they pray for you, then God hears you. Even if they're dead, even if the Rebbe is dead, his spirit, his soul can still reach up to Hashem and communicate your desire, your prayers, even beyond death. And that custom is still practiced today in the Hasidic world. These tzaddukim, these rabbis, are almost divine. They're saints, basically. And the Rebbe drinks a little bit of schnapps before this, you should drink a little bit of schnapps because he's discovered some secret way of accessing mysticism. If he dances like this, you should dance like this. Everything the Rebbe does has some inner deep meaning, and the Rebbe is in many ways the gateway to God. So the Rebbes, the leaders of these Hasidic dynasties, are these figures in many ways. And these courts get established all through Eastern Europe, and they are fabulous. You're talking about dudes wearing hats that cost thousands of gold, wearing silver garments that are like knit through with gold and silver thread. Because again, your very clothing is a gateway to God, and the more beautiful you are, the more you glorify yourself. Of course, at some level, it helps you to be more connected to God. Because God's a king, then maybe you should be able to. And so the outfits they wear, and to this day, the outfits they wear cost tens of thousands of dollars for a coat. Tens of thousands, $40,000, $50,000 for a hat. Because it's all about the glory, the kavod of the Rebbe. So they go on to become the central pillars of the Hasidic movement, even to this day. So you probably know some of the Satmar court, which is now split between two brothers who had a nasty dispute since the former Rebbe of the Satmar died. The Satmar movement is the biggest. If you saw Unorthodox, folks saw Unorthodox, the television show, that depicts the Satmar. Probably folks know the Chabad Lubavitch movement. Chabad is a philosophy of Hasidism. Lubavitch is actually a dynasty. The Lubavitch movement is primarily known for its truth. Chabad is a philosophy of Hasidism. Lubavitch is actually a dynasty. The Lubavitch movement is primarily known for its outreach. They are a very outward-looking Hasidic movement that wants to bring people into Judaism, and they want to bring people into Judaism because that's part of how that's how they're going to redeem the world. Of course, they're also known for their, at least some section of them in their belief that their late Rebbe of blessed memory is the Messiah, which I've been to his grave. He's carried out Queens a couple times, and it's a powerful spiritual experience to bring it at the grave of the Rebbe. There's also a Rebbe's grave here in Detroit. If you ever get a chance to visit one, there's a Rebbe's grave here. Bells, and now it's a pilgrimage site. You know, going to visit the graves of the Rebbe is a big deal in the Hasidic world. Nachman of Breslov, if you go to the Breslov tomb, it's a thousands to see them to invade this Ukrainian town for like a week. So it's a big deal there. Rabbis is that they weren't just enthusiastic, charismatic leaders who relied on emotions and enthusiasm to rope people in. These are systematic thinkers. Many of them were carefully systematic thinkers, and they produced some of the most innovative texts of Kabbalah of that time. Now, are they as rigorous as what's coming out of the Litvak school? No. Or locus coming out of Beit El or Jerusalem? No. But they are systematic treatises on Kabbalah from the point of view of Hasidism, which seeks to make Kabbalah something that you live. It's a thing that you live. It's a thing that you experience. It's a thing that and so it's not, in many ways, the kind of highly intellectualist Kabbalah that existed in the Lithuanian world. It's a much more livable kind of Kabbalah. Of course, the most famous book of this form of Kabbalah is the Tanya, which is something like scripture, basically, for the Lubavitch movement. You can get a copy of the Tanya anywhere. You can go anywhere there's a Chabad Lubavitch, they will happily give you a copy of the Tanya. It's a little bit controversial because they claim that basically non-Jews don't have souls. They do a lot of acrobatics to try to explain that away, but it has some pretty famous and infamous parts. But the Tanya is probably the most famous. There are tons of Kabbalistic text written in the Hasidic world, and never let anyone tell you they lie perpetuated by people that I typically actually sympathize with, but it's simply not true. These books are incredibly deep, incredibly powerful. Now, you might imagine this faced enormous kickback. They had just dealt with that fiasco. You've got people doing damn headstands during prayer as part of their They're like, you people are out of control. You're just Shabbatians, right? You're just all crypto Shabbatians. You're bringing all this stuff that led us into perdition with Shabtai Tzvi. You need to stop. And they were led by the Gaon of Vilna. And the Gaon of Vilna was a vociferous opponent of the Hasidic movement. The Lithuanian schools typically referred to as misnagdim, the opponents, right? Typically, sometimes I'm kind of misnogged in my personality, which is funny because I have lots of Hasidic friends, and the joke is, I'm more misnogged and they're more Hasidic, obviously. But this was a brutal for a couple generations. And I will say that, in all honesty, the Misnagdim aren't completely wrong here, folks. The early generations of the Hasidic movement, the first couple generations of the Hasidic movement were recruiting in. You have to think about this in the aftermath of the Shabtai Tzvi thing. They are terrified that it's going to go off the rails again. They're going to get one of these rabbis to pop off and say they're Messiah, and we're going to have to deal with the exact same disaster again. And I've gone through some of these already in our previous talk, but you can begin to see the misnogged perspective, like a little Messiah. That there's sort of a transgression for the sake of having an angle here. There's kind of like that you have to experience the sin of lust, and you have to convert to God. And then you convert it to feel lust for God, love for God. These Messiahs were like, no, don't feel lust. It's a hara. Why would you cultivate the feeling of lust? You cannot do that. You have to convert. You need to minimize that. Not feel it and then convert it. And so they worried that this was kind of the cultivation of Averas, sins. Both of these movements emerge in Poland. The Shabbati movement in Europe emerged from the exact tiny region of Poland. And many people thought we grew up from the same earth. It's the same thing. Also, they are popularizing Kabbalah. Remember, right? Books like the Tanya by Shirazam and Abiyadi, blessed memory, they are trying to bring Kabbalah back to the masses. That's one of the things that the Kabbalists this time are trying to stop. People were led astray by these ideas. Not because the ideas are bad, maybe not because the people are inherently not capable of understanding them, they just can't understand them with their level of education. You cannot get these ideas to these people because it will go off the rails again. Hasidism says no. You bring them along, you teach them, you give them a little bit at a time until you raise them up until they understand these matters. So there's a much higher degree of willingness in the Hasidic world to incorporate Kabbalistic ideas into their connection to the masses. That the establishment, especially this is all weird stuff, doing cartwheels during prayer, people screaming during prayer. One of the Hasidic dynasties that exists is the Karliners. The Karliners are they're the most metal because they're infamous for screaming all of their prayers out loud. So if you ever go to a Karliner shul, their prayers. You can imagine for a bunch of heady, intellectual, university-trained Jewish Kabbalists, a bunch of dudes screaming all the time, crying on their shoulders. That's crazy. This is Shabbatianism again, right? So, Abu Dhabi early on was very worrying for this. The court setting with these rabbis, actually, Shabbatites, they did that when he was in Migdal Oz. He did that when he was in exile, Montenegro, now Montenegro. They're just being little Shabbatites. These rabbis are just being little Shabbatites. They're just little messiahs. In the rise of Messianism and Chabad Lubavitch, they were terrified when these guys would pop off and declare themselves messiahs. Further, some Shabbatian books were popular among early Hasidim. Hemda Yamin was a big one, right? But there were other crypto Shabbatian books that were popular among early Hasidim. So, the way the Mitnagim saw the Hasidic movement, at least early on, was that if it's not Shabbatianism, it's diet Shabbatianism. It's Shabbatianism light. It's Shabbatianism that has all of the same dangerous ingredients. Like it leads to the problem we just had, it's just not there yet. And so they were terrified of this movement. And they were terrified of the movement both because they wanted to maintain the integrity of Judaism, but also because they were terrified of having the Shabbat thing put off again, if there were another one. And again, I know it's easy to kick the Mitnagim as this sort of like intellectualist, I don't know, fogies or whatever. They were trying to shepherd a movement after spiritual, the last thing they wanted. Now, what's happening and what's incredibly important, and I think that this is what makes obviously proof of the proof of the pudding in the taste. The Hasidic movement was ultimately not Shabbating out, it was Shabbating again. And how do we know that? In a generation or two, it became very rigorous. They are halakhic as a day is long. Now they have weird halakhic stuff. They follow a different minhag and live by people who follow a much more Sephardi style minhag, which is odd because they're in Central Europe. They might put moed, which is unusual, specifically Kabbalistic thing, and found in most of the Hasidic religions do it. They do some unusual things. But at the end of the day, it's a halakhically conservative group. They come down the side of the old school Kabbalah, which was Jewish law. It's the gateway to God. And following the halakha is a fundamental aspect of Kabbalah. So for all of the excesses, for all of the court, for all of the studies, for all the rabbis, for all of the usual stuff that they do, for all the cartwheels they might do during prayer, screaming things and whatever, at the end of the day, the law is the law, they don't break it. Both sides of this equation, both Mitnagim and the Hasidim, they spent generations executing each other. They excommunicate each other like everyone. It's just a dreadful situation. I think local authorities had to intervene on several occasions and things like this. Also, I should point this out in the defense of Hasidim again, because I identify more as a big dog world. I will say that the Besht, the founder of the Hasidic movement, was one of the Talmudists that actively opposed the Frankish movement. So, from the very very beginning, they were opposed to things like Frankenstein. Rabbi Rothschild, the founder of Hasidism, was opposed to it. So again, he was pro-Talmud camp, taught Talmud, etc. So I just want to, again, we all have our biases. I don't want to make my bias. I'm much more pro the Litvak world, and I'm also the richness, the genius, and the deep spiritual power of the Hasidic movement. Just make it very clear that while I'm saying that there is a link at some level with the Hasidic world and the Shabbatian world, I think that is homologous, not one of common ancestry, and not one in which the Hasidic world was a crypto-Shabbatian. I do not believe that. I'm not attributing that to that. I want to make that very clear because I don't want to appear as if I'm slandering Hasidic people. I don't want to ever appear to be. I've learned in Hasidic yeshiva, trust me, I have a deep respect for these things. Hasidism would go on to become one form of Orthodox Judaism. In fact, if you probably encountered Orthodox Judaism, you probably encountered it through Hasidism. I bet everyone here, Jewish, has encountered Chabad at some level. And if you have encountered Hasidism, now, they're the most outwardly looking of the Hasidic world. Learned in a Hasidic environment. You probably Hasidic in Kabbalah. That form of Kabbalah became very popular, filtered down all the way to Jewish practice and belief. So Hasidism has proved decisive in Jewish history. Now, other high-level Kabbalah, more academic, more intellectualist Kabbalah, would continue to go on in the Litvak world all the way to now. My understanding is it's still going on. I don't know much about it. Lurianic Kabbalah, it would stick, especially Lurianic Kabbalah as taken up by Simon Talmud. Why? Why is there no further significant development in Kabbalah following Lurianic? And the answer is Shabbatism. Major innovation in Kabbalah that they de facto settled on. They more or less said, we're not going to change this, we're not going to muck around with it, we will continue to systematize it, we will continue to adopt it, we'll continue to adapt it, we'll modernize it, we'll systematize it with Cordovero, we'll turn it round and round. But I think that there was no major Kabbalistic innovation, systematic innovation after Luria, because I think that there was such a shell shock after the Shabbat says. So Luria and Kabbalah won. And all Kabbalah basically that exists now is some species of Luria and Kabbalah. So he won. We are all living in the shadow of Luria. And again, I think that the reason why there's never been another new kind of Kabbalah after Luria, basically because it's a shell shock of it. But as you might imagine, there's a dark cloud on the horizon, right? And depending on how you view it, it might be a dark cloud, or it might be the clouds finally parted. It could be a dark cloud because what you might see coming is rationalism. What you might see coming is logic. What you might see coming is modernity, which strips the world of all spirituality and subjects it to a law of mechanism and logic, mathematics and science, and it robs the world of spirituality. That might be the dark cloud that you see coming. If you see something else, you might look at the same thing and see some clouds of darkness finally, after 1,000 years of darkness. The mysticism of random speculation about a world that no one has access to, a world of backwardness and superstition, a world where people believe in all kinds of nonsense that they can't prove. And you might see the clouds parting and the sun shining through in the form of logic and science and modernity. But if you're on team B, then Haskalah, the Enlightenment, is your buddy. Because what's about to happen is that the Enlightenment is tearing through the non-Jewish world. And it's making enormous strides. The Industrial Revolution's beginning, huge gains are being made in human rights. Right? This is the time there, the French Revolution, American Revolution. There's a huge point in the non-Jewish world towards logic. In the Jewish world, in Central Europe, there are some Jews who are beginning to look out and see, I think that Jews may be onto something. And they began the process. The end of Newton, the enlightenment of Kant. Again, the same year that Shabtai Tzvi apostatized is this calculus, discovered the fundamental nature of light, and wrote his main book on physics. That shows you how the world is so different. Shabtai is apostatizing in Turkey, and Newton is on the path. And by the time we get to the 1700s, the Jewish Enlightenment is beginning to take effect. The Haskalah will begin to take effect. And what we're going to see is that in the aftermath of the Haskalah, which we'll talk about next time, the arrival of Enlightenment values in Judaism, that we're going to see a huge shift in Kabbalah. The 19th and 20th centuries will represent both an incredible loss in the world, the loss of life, the Holocaust, of course, but also the rebirth of Kabbalah. The fact that we're having this conversation right now means something's changed. We are modern Jews for whom most of us would declare by the studying for the past 50 years. All of us would be there, probably. Many of us would never been allowed to study Kabbalah if you're not Jewish according to their rules. Or if you're not Jewish at all. We are, at some level, the inheritors of what's about to change. And what we're going to see is interesting travails of Kabbalah into the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, where it will undergo some of the most horrifying feats. And it will rise from those ashes. And some of the most important Kabbalistic texts are now available within the last 5 years. The Zohar and Brisker edition are now available to us. So next time we're going to turn our attention to the 19th, 20th, and 21st century, talk about the sort of vicissitudes of Kabbalah in the aftermath of the last invasion, which is Hasidism. We'll talk about sort of the post-Hasidic world. What does the world in the aftermath of the Hasidic world, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, with the rise of the internet, with the rise of liberal Judaism, what is Kabbalah? How does Kabbalah adapt, and survive in all of those environments? And as you know, listening to the sound of my voice, talking about Kabbalah, you know that the story is a happy one. Kabbalah survives and thrives. We'll talk about that process. Welcome back, and thank you for joining me as I explore the garden that is Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Again, if you'd like to support my work in providing accessible, free, and scholarly content on topics of Kabbalah, alchemy, and occult, magic, hermetic, philosophy, consider supporting my work on Patreon and donation. You can find those links below. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoteric, the Arcane, in history, philosophy, and religion.
He said, if you sit down for walking for 3 hours, I have an obligation to give you my best. All the time. Says Michael Jordan, if you sit down for walking for 3 hours, I have an obligation to give you my best all the time. And then it's ready to give you your best. Will that home in Israel? He's here. When I moved up to the name. Whether at home in Israel or to inspire all of us to be our best in Israel. Adam, small. This person was one show, somewhere else. Oh, here, Billy mentioned this jokes and shit. Why would I say? Sure. Let's see how long it takes. Then we set the spot by David Salvin, getting to the memory of Lucky Larry Small Boston, 19 goes to those rough. I broke it down, so we tried to follow back to that. Now, it's a broken guy. Bounce down, and they do different things that have a good show about it. That's it. Anonymous, which they know the bullshit in itself. I apologize. I'm fucking on the, we're back to the trip. Spilling up this thing. How many people signed up? The Warriors were max 35. Yeah. So the growth family heavy on saying on the rebellion to change my meaning of life. Lightning out lightning, loves market bending, whole voice in the talking of the water. Smoke, shower, smoke. Monkey splashes, Irish sign, before saying off other Mary Barber area. Maybe as you like, which name my extra Messina. Sharon Mary last, but plus 55 female Nazi. Another to the American portrayal for all the all missiles, which they saw mission on his motion of putting on the fullest. Send that kind of you that Seaboard, what I think is what's time trouble in the South. Another to the American Republic, Southern, Rockle by Southern. All periods of life. Responsible as for the selections, the family of Pastor Shabbataya. Officials, the bishop, everyone trapped. Today's job is passing by. Must be respect. Go ahead. This is Pastor, that will play this right now. Just the families. This person's life is still past the last majority. So we go on the first and third set. Boy, our fun. Which then the only thing they could ever say, bro. Which they don't want to buy. It's a yellow to and a yellow. That's the. Not so bad. But one side, you're holding someone in front of him space. Where it says, I like it. What the simple? Let's say, hold out. The guy. What the simple? And torn up by mistake, you don't want to know that. You know, like when you come to your 5-year-old gold, like less than 3-year-old, and he looks at a mistake. You kind of don't want to do it. Looks at everybody goes over. What's the color? You have to be correct. What for photographs? Anybody? What do you say? Very good. What else? Huh? That's Aaron Schwartz. What else? This is good. This will be one. You were here last night. Please. Roll. Thank you. Please. Anybody? Sit there. The answer is yeah. Shocker. So which one? Find out. Voice and another. Great. Learn the mission you had of a collector. What's more important? Bread that you bring on sports or plus. In other words, what's wrong if you don't bring everything on? Which one is the more important? Short is candy with bread. Candy bread. I'm pretty sure which one. We also saw something very interesting. We learned that it's something that we don't even talk about around shops. We want to say bread, two sheets, we saw Ali looking up, what's that show? So, the sheep has really trust it. All of a sudden, first one, she got tail left, boom, 2 rams, 7 sheep. And we talked and spoke with all our sheep, so a whole lot more is there left than the sheep. And what is it? You're right, the focus is on. Those are very important. Those are singular. Still, we're not happy. No. And I mean, you don't understand what the point of the and even says the most important thing out of this is, and they're not as important thing on the streets. In the fish, they sort of these. But he said, look, the midbar, all they did was sheep. They didn't have bread. No bread yet. Frozen and frozen bread. So she brought her own food. You're right anyway. So I did this one of the yesterday. I did it in this format because I think it's more important for like brothers. The club goes with the right, the compliment of the club. You go with the design of the what's the design talks about bread. And Paul's press talks about sheep. Paul's talks about both. The Paul's is that this community, so it's still one of the bottom of the whole world. Let's go with Paul's design, let's go with Paul's stuff. And Nana says that it's supposed to listen, you gotta be room for look. Now that's what I said awesome. I gotta pause it for a second, but I'm coming back. Mention thing. You know that the drivers are moving the fire like down there. Bring that to the hospital, right? Right? But once in a while, the famous lights of mine, the other lights of that was, I really had to, what it was on. So, Buffalo was going on the trip, they were going to miss the football. That would be this, or that would be this football. That option. Now they can take the football, they go for me, they don't miss the football. So, what a football. The Shiva that he's on the street. He never missed a minute in his life, never missed it. So he said, he was trying to do this. This is what you have to do today. You go and beat some guys, discuss it a little bit. You have to go. We're not going to the Alabama part of it. What if down the Alabama? Sticks are not good. He said, I want to work players. I'm going to play ready to go and have a great. How many years do you have in school? 12 years. That was yesterday. So I looked at one of the conference with a friend, and he promised, gave me the ice stuff. My time in there, Kiva, Gomar, Kiev, with the what's with the shop? He says, I'm going to learn Zion. It says it's supposed to be Zion with the and what does it say about the Zion? It says the red. Red is talking. So, bread. Bananas go higher. Bananas learn to you. It's better to learn. I'm going to look for that. That says, Boston, sheep is the name. Well, I'm That bread is the most it's a perfect match. You, whatever thing. You want to remember that one. You, that you, what's the match? Oh, they already small show up everybody play. Play goes check the house. It's a wrap. Which goes back in the beautiful thing. It was very interesting. Last night, I really came there doing the whole thing with lighting. I want to put in lights. It's going to help the video. So he's here. And he left literally 30 seconds before the photo. So like, what a shame. And then he comes back. He came back. So I said, we shall have fun. There you go. Came back. Check it out.
You're fine. Go fuck yourself.
Check it.